Boredom isn't harmless. It's quietly training your brain to crave escape, and most addictions don't start with pain. They start with emptiness. Most people think addiction is about excess, weakness, or lack of discipline. That belief is not just wrong, it's dangerous, because boredom doesn't feel threatening, yet it slowly rewires desire, dopamine, and self-control. When life feels flat, the brain doesn't wait for meaning. It looks for stimulation. And that's where addiction begins its work, silently, patiently, almost politely. This video reveals why boredom lowers resistance, amplifies craving, and turns harmless habits into compulsive ones. More importantly, it shows the real solution. Not willpower, not avoidance, but something far deeper and more effective. By the end, boredom won't look innocent anymore. It'll look like the warning sign it always was. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee how to stop the cycle. Boredom isn't silence, it's noise without direction. It feels harmless at first, like waiting in line with nothing to do. But underneath, boredom is a quiet craving, a low-grade itch in the mind. The brain hates emptiness the way lungs hate a lack of air. So when meaning fades, stimulation steps in to fill the gap. This is where addiction quietly warms up backstage. Not because someone is weak, but because the mind is starving. Starving for novelty, for purpose, for a spark of dopamine. Boredom whispers, just feel something. And the brain listens more often than people admit. Think of boredom like hunger disguised as laziness. When the body lacks nutrients, it craves junk food. When the mind lacks meaning, it craves easy pleasure. Scrolling, drinking, binging, gambling, same pattern, different costumes. Addiction isn't born from desire alone. It grows from deprivation. A bored brain lowers its standards for satisfaction. What once felt exciting now feels flat, almost invisible. So the mind turns the volume up, chasing stronger stimulation. Dopamine spikes become substitutes for direction. And suddenly, habits start forming where purpose should have lived. A mentor would say this gently but clearly. Boredom is a signal, not a flaw. It's the dashboard light blinking, not the engine failure itself. Yet most people smash the radio louder instead of checking the signal. They numb the discomfort instead of decoding it. That's how escapism sneaks in wearing the mask of relief. The brain learns fast. Boredom equals discomfort. Pleasure equals escape. Repeat that loop long enough and self-control starts to thin out. Craving becomes automatic, almost reflexive. Not because life is unbearable, but because it feels flat. And flatness over time becomes intolerable. Picture a man finishing work with no goals waiting at home, no project, no challenge, no reason to stay mentally awake. The couch becomes quicksand, the phone becomes anesthesia. At first it's harmless, just rest, just distraction, but boredom stretches and the mind starts negotiating. One drink won't hurt, one more episode won't matter. The brain is simply trying to feel alive again. Dopamine answers faster than purpose ever could, and that's how addiction begins quietly, politely. Not with chaos, but with routine boredom. Here's the uncomfortable wisdom few talk about. Boredom erodes resistance. The longer meaning stays absent, the louder cravings speak. Self-control isn't just about discipline, it's about engagement. A mind without stimulation seeks it wherever it can. That's why idle time feels heavier than hard work. Effort gives shape, boredom dissolves it. The solution isn't constant pleasure, it's intentional direction. Small challenges, learning, building something real. Books like Man's Search for Meaning or Atomic Habits help reframe this hunger. Because once boredom reveals its appetite, the next question becomes dangerous and necessary. When life loses texture, the brain starts hunting for exits, not dramatic escapes, small ones, subtle, socially acceptable. A bored mind doesn't scream, it sighs and scrolls. Flat days make the brain restless, like a trapped animal pacing a cage. It's not chasing pleasure at first, it's running from emptiness. That's how escapism enters the scene quietly. The brain isn't broken, it's understimulated. And when stimulation is missing, shortcuts become tempting. Addiction often begins as relief, not excess, a way to feel something instead of nothing. Think of the brain like a river. When it flows with purpose, it's calm and directed. When it stagnates, it starts to smell. Boredom is stagnation of meaning. Without movement, the mind creates turbulence. Dopamine becomes the emergency current. Quick hits replace long-term fulfillment. Scrolling replaces creating. Consuming replaces building. And slowly, the brain forgets how to wait. A wise mentor would say, the brain hates flatness more than pain. Pain at least means something is happening. Flatness feels like emotional suffocation. That's why people sabotage calm lives without knowing why. They're not chasing chaos, they're escaping numbness. The brain confuses stimulation with aliveness, so it reaches for sugar, alcohol, porn, drama, noise. Each hit teaches the same lesson. Escape works briefly, but every escape trains the mind to avoid stillness. And stillness is where clarity lives. Imagine someone who wakes up, works, eats, sleeps, repeat. No learning, no curiosity, no friction. At night, the urge to unwind feels irresistible. One drink turns into two. One video turns into an hour. The brain is stretching its legs after mental confinement, but instead of growth, it chooses sedation. That's the tragedy of boredom. It looks peaceful from the outside. Inside, the mind is starving for expansion, and addiction feeds on that starvation. Here's a practical shift that changes everything. Give the brain something to climb, not pleasure, challenge. Learning a skill, lifting weights, writing, studying psychology or philosophy. Books like Deep Work by Cal Newport or Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi help here. They restore texture to life. When the brain engages deeply, cravings lose volume. Escapism fades when meaning returns. Addiction struggles where purpose is present, because a moving mind doesn't need exits. And that realization quietly opens the door to the next layer of the problem. A mentor would lean in here and say this softly: addiction isn't the enemy, it's the messenger. Most people attack the behavior and ignore the signal behind it. They fight the substance, the screen, the habit, but the real issue sits deeper, quieter, untouched. Addiction shows up where something essential went missing, meaning direction, connection, take your pick. The brain doesn't invent cravings without a reason. It responds to an internal absence. Treat the symptom alone, and it simply changes masks. Think of addiction like smoke in a room. You can wave it away all day, but it keeps coming back. Why? Because the fire is still burning somewhere unseen. Boredom, emotional neglect, unresolved frustration, these are sparks. Dopamine becomes the smoke signal. The brain uses pleasure to self-medicate discomfort. That's why willpower alone rarely wins. You're asking discipline to fight a deeper wound. And wounds don't respond to commands. They respond to understanding and care. A bored life with no emotional outlet is fertile ground. The mind says, if I can't fix the problem, I'll numb it. That's not weakness, it's survival logic. Addiction is the brain's attempt at balance. Temporary, flawed, but effective in the short term. That's why cravings feel convincing. They promise relief, not destruction. The danger isn't the pleasure itself. It's mistaking relief for healing, and repeating that mistake until it hardens into habit. Picture someone quitting a bad habit through sheer force. They last weeks, maybe months, but nothing meaningful replaced the habit. No new structure, no new identity. Eventually, boredom creeps back in, dressed differently, and the craving returns, stronger, smarter. That's relapse, not failure. The brain goes back to what once worked. Without purpose, it defaults to pleasure, because pleasure is always available. Here's the wiser path. Treat the absence, not the urge. Build meaning slowly, deliberately. Set goals that stretch you just enough to matter. Read books like Man's Search for Meaning or The Power of Now. Replace numbing routines with engaging ones. Exercise, learning, creating. These retrain dopamine naturally. When life feels rich, cravings feel poor. Addiction weakens when the void shrinks. And once you see it this way, another uncomfortable truth emerges, because the brain's chemistry itself plays a bigger role than most realize. The brain isn't wired to reward fulfillment the way people expect. It rewards pursuit, novelty, anticipation. Dopamine doesn't celebrate arrival, it celebrates the chase. That's why boredom feels unbearable. Without something new or challenging, dopamine levels dip. The mind interprets that dip as discomfort, not pain, but restlessness. So the brain starts scanning for quick novelty. Anything that promises a spike will do. This is where addiction finds its chemistry. Think of dopamine like a motivational fuel, not a happiness hormone. It pushes the brain forward, not inward. When life lacks goals, dopamine has nowhere to flow, so it leaks into shortcuts, social media, junk food, porn, substances, fast novelty. Each hit resets the baseline a little higher. What once excited now barely registers. The brain adapts, always hungry for more. Boredom accelerates this process because stagnation starves the system. A mentor would warn, repeated novelty without effort dulls satisfaction. It's like turning up the volume because you've damaged your hearing. Eventually, silence feels unbearable. That's what constant stimulation does to the brain. It trains intolerance for stillness. Focus weakens, patience thins. Self-control erodes quietly, not because the person is undisciplined, but because their dopamine system is overtrained. Look at someone scrolling for hours. They're not enjoying it. They're chasing micro-rewards. Each swipe promises something new. Each miss deepens the boredom. The brain stays locked in pursuit mode. That same loop fuels addiction. The mind learns. Effort is optional. Reward is instant. Real fulfillment can't compete at first. It's slower, quieter, earned. But that slowness is exactly what heals. Rebalancing dopamine doesn't mean cutting pleasure entirely. It means reintroducing effort-based reward. Exercise, learning a language, building a skill. Reading Dopamine Nation or Atomic Habits helps reset perspective. Cold showers, delayed gratification, focused work retrains sensitivity. Boredom becomes tolerable again. Silence becomes useful. And cravings lose their urgency. Because when novelty is earned, it satisfies deeper, which leads directly to the role meaning plays in all of this. When meaning fades, the brain doesn't panic. It adapts. It switches from growth mode to survival mode, and in survival, stimulation replaces purpose. The mind says, if life doesn't inspire me, I'll anesthetize myself. That's how boredom turns dangerous. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly corrosive. Meaning gives weight to time. Without it, days blur together. And blurred days invite shortcuts. Addiction thrives in that blur. A meaningful life stretches you. It gives friction, resistance, direction. A meaningless one feels smooth, easy, and empty. The brain hates emptiness more than effort, so it seeks stimulation to simulate aliveness, noise instead of depth, intensity instead of significance. Dopamine becomes a life raft, not because the person wants excess, but because they're trying not to drown in flatness. Picture someone with no long-term goal, no project pulling them forward. Even comfort starts to feel like suffocation. That's why people sabotage stability. Drama, substances, compulsive habits, anything to feel intensity. The brain confuses intensity with meaning, but intensity fades fast. Meaning compounds slowly. One leaves you emptier, the other builds resilience over time. This is why boredom often precedes relapse. When structure disappears, cravings grow louder. Weekends, vacations, idle evenings, danger zones. Not because free time is bad, but because unstructured time exposes the void. A mentor would advise, plan, meaning not avoidance, volunteer, train, learn, create, read, start with Why or the War of Art. Give your mind something worth resisting temptation for. Purpose is the strongest boundary. Here's the subtle truth. Stimulation feels urgent, meaning feels distant. The brain chooses urgency by default. Unless you teach it otherwise, small missions change everything. Daily goals, weekly challenges, long-term visions. When meaning returns, boredom weakens. And when boredom weakens, addiction loses leverage. Because survival mode switches off, the mind remembers how to aim forward, and that awakening sets the stage for an even quieter enemy. Silence is never neutral to the mind. When the noise stops, something always surfaces. Thoughts, memories, regrets, questions long avoided. That's why boredom feels uncomfortable. It strips away distraction, and distraction has been doing a lot of emotional labor. Addiction offers a faster exit. One click, one sip, one hit. Silence disappears, but so does awareness, and awareness is where growth begins. A mentor would say, people aren't afraid of silence itself. They're afraid of what silence reveals. Boredom forces confrontation with unmet dreams, with wasted time, with choices postponed. The brain, sensing threat, reaches for numbing tools. Escapism feels like protection, but it's borrowed safety. And borrowed safety always comes with interest. Think of distraction, like fog. It doesn't remove obstacles, it hides them. When boredom lifts the fog, reality appears sharper. That sharpness can hurt. So the mind runs back to noise, phones, substances, constant input. Each one trains intolerance for stillness. Over time, silence feels hostile, not peaceful, hostile. Look at how uncomfortable people get without stimulation. Waiting rooms, elevators, quiet nights. The phone comes out instantly. That reflex isn't habit, it's avoidance. Avoidance of internal dialogue. Yet every meaningful insight comes from stillness. Reading, journaling, long walks without headphones. Books like Meditations or Stillness is the key teach this. They turn silence into a tool, not a threat. A place to recover self-control. When silence becomes tolerable, boredom loses power. Cravings weaken without constant triggers. The mind relearns how to sit with itself. That's when clarity shows up, and clarity exposes patterns behind addiction, not to shame, but to understand. Understanding breaks unconscious loops, and once loops are visible, they're breakable, which leads to the subtle danger of routine itself. Because routine can either anchor you or trap you. Routine can be a scaffold or a cage. When it's built around purpose, it stabilizes the mind. When it's empty, it suffocates it. Boredom doesn't come from lack of activity, it comes from lack of intention. Doing the same things without knowing why dulls awareness. Days turn mechanical, and the brain rebels against mechanical living. Compulsion becomes protest. Addiction becomes the escape hatch. A purposeless routine numbs emotion. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Nothing wrong on paper, everything wrong internally. The brain needs markers of progress. Without them, it feels trapped in a loop. Dopamine stops responding to repetition, so it searches for novelty elsewhere. That's why habits intensify at night, when routine finally loosens its grip. Think of the mind like a muscle. Repetition without challenge weakens it. Routine without growth atrophies motivation. That's when compulsive behaviors sneak in, not because the person is reckless, but because they're understimulated. A bored brain invents urgency. Cravings feel important. They break monotony. Even destructive ones feel alive. A mentor would suggest upgrading routine, not abandoning it. Add friction intentionally. Train before work. Study something difficult at night. Replace passive habits with active ones. Swap scrolling for reading. Deep work, the compound effect. Schedule discomfort. Routine should demand something from you. That demand keeps addiction at bay, because effort restores balance. When routine carries meaning, boredom fades. When boredom fades, compulsions quiet down. The mind relaxes into structure instead of resisting it. Self-control strengthens naturally, not through force, through alignment. And once routine is purposeful, another shift becomes possible, because direction returns, and with direction, urges lose authority. Which brings us to how focus shapes desire itself. When direction disappears, desire takes the wheel. The brain hates uncertainty. Without a clear aim, it defaults to impulse. Pleasure becomes a compass, not because it's wise, but because it's immediate. Boredom amplifies this effect. An unfocused life leaves too much empty space, and empty space invites craving. Addiction fills what direction should guide. Direction gives the brain hierarchy. This matters more than most realize. When goals exist, urges compete and often lose. When goals vanish, urges run unopposed. The mind asks, why not now? Delayed gratification stops making sense. Dopamine wants resolution, so it chooses the fastest path. Pleasure feels like progress, even when it's actually retreat. A mentor might say, a drifting ship obeys every wave. Without direction, every desire feels reasonable. That's why boredom is dangerous. It removes the friction of purpose. Small temptations grow loud. Self-control weakens without a reference point. The brain can't prioritize without vision, so it indulges, not rebelliously, automatically. Look at people who maintain discipline easily. They're not superhuman, they're aimed. Fitness goals, creative projects, learning paths. They trade short-term pleasure for long-term satisfaction. Because direction reframes boredom, idle time becomes preparation, not emptiness. Reading Think and Grow Rich, or The 7 Habits, helps build this mindset. Direction quiets cravings, because desire finally has competition. Restoring direction doesn't require grand ambition. Small, clear goals work best. Daily targets, weekly progress markers. The brain needs something to move toward. When it has that, pleasure loses urgency. Addiction struggles to compete with meaning. Because focus reorganizes desire. And once desire is organized, resistance becomes easier, which leads to how boredom slowly weakens self-control itself. Self-control isn't a fixed trait. It's a resource that depletes under certain conditions. Boredom is one of the most underestimated. When the mind feels understimulated, resisting temptation feels heavier, not because the urge is stronger, but because resistance feels pointless. The brain asks, what's the reward for saying no? If meaning is absent, there's no answer. So self-control slowly erodes, quietly, over time. Think of self-control like a muscle held in tension. Without rest or purpose, it fatigues. Boredom stretches that muscle endlessly. Idle time increases exposure to temptation. More time, fewer anchors. The mind starts negotiating. Just this once becomes routine language. Cravings feel justified, not urgent, reasonable. And reasonable urges are the hardest to resist. A mentor would point out something uncomfortable. Boredom creates moral fatigue, not ethical failure, decision exhaustion. When nothing meaningful demands attention, temptations step in. The brain prefers action to emptiness, even bad action. That's why people relapse when they're bored, not stressed. Stress at least provides structure. Boredom dissolves it. And in that vacuum, habits reassert themselves, especially familiar ones. Consider weekends with no plan, long evenings with no structure, vacation days with too much freedom. Self-control is tested most when nothing is required. That's when addiction whispers loudest. A mentor's advice is practical. Reduce exposure, change environments, fill time intentionally, train, read, build, volunteer. Structure protects willpower. Here's the reframe. Boredom isn't weakness, it's a warning. It signals that self-control is being drained. The fix isn't harsher discipline. It's better engagement. Challenge restores strength. Meaning restores resistance. When the mind is occupied, urges fade, not disappear, but soften. And that softness opens space for the final insight. Because there is one antidote boredom can't fight. Meaning doesn't shout, it stabilizes. Where meaning exists, addiction struggles to breathe. Not because temptation disappears, but because it loses importance. The brain stops asking, how do I escape? And starts asking, what am I building? Boredom can't survive in a life that feels necessary. Purpose gives weight to effort, and effort gives dignity to discomfort. That's where cravings begin to weaken. A mentor would say this clearly: discipline is fragile without meaning. You can force yourself for a while, but force cracks under boredom. Meaning, on the other hand, anchors behavior. When something matters deeply, saying no feels easier. Not heroic, logical. The brain reorders priorities naturally. Dopamine realigns with progress. Small wins feel satisfying again. Addiction loses its leverage. Think of meaning like gravity. It keeps your actions in orbit. Without it, you drift toward the nearest pleasure. With it, even boredom feels purposeful. Training when tired, studying when distracted, creating when uninspired. These acts rebuild self-respect, and self-respect changes behavior faster than guilt ever could. Addiction feeds on shame, not purpose. Meaning doesn't require a dramatic mission. It starts small and personal. Taking care of your body, being reliable to others, learning something difficult, building a skill that compounds over time. Books like Man's Search for Meaning or The Alchemist reinforce this path. When life feels meaningful, boredom becomes rest, not danger. Silence becomes space, not threat. And cravings lose their urgency. Here's the quiet truth. Addiction fades when life feels worth protecting, not perfect, worth it. Meaning reframes boredom as a pause, not a void. The brain stops begging for escape. It learns patience again. That patience restores choice, and choice restores power. Once someone feels that shift, they're no longer fighting addiction. They're building something that leaves no room for it. Now the responsibility quietly shifts to the viewer. Because understanding boredom changes nothing unless action follows. If boredom has been driving addiction, distraction, or compulsive habits, then awareness is the turning point. The question is no longer why it happens, it's what will be done next. Will boredom continue to be numbed, or will it finally be listened to? This knowledge isn't meant to impress, it's meant to be used. To redesign routines with intention, to replace empty stimulation with meaningful challenge. To choose direction over impulse, effort over escape. Every small decision rewires dopamine, every purposeful action weakens craving, and every moment of conscious engagement restores self-control. So here's the provocation. What habit are you using to escape boredom instead of answering it? What would happen if just for a week you replaced that habit with growth? What skill would you build? What book would you read? What discipline would you train? Because the life you don't consciously design will be designed by cravings. If this message resonated, don't let it fade into another forgotten insight. Subscribe to Mind's Silent Echo. Turn on notifications. Stay close to ideas that sharpen awareness instead of numbing it. Because a meaningful life doesn't happen by accident. It's built quietly, one conscious choice at a time.